when you really delve into her work and the impact of her work, it's so surprising that more members of the public and curators and historians aren't aware of her work and her legacy, as she forms such a key component of so many important aspects of both Australian art history but also French Cubism and French art history, as a potter, as a Cubist, in Australia in terms of Australian modernism. And she leaves a really substantial and important artistic legacy. Anne Dangar was born in the regional New South Wales town of Kempsey and spent her early years there before moving to Sydney, where she eventually studied at the Sydney Art School, which was headed by Julian Ashton, a central figure in Australian Impressionism in the late 19th century. In 1914, she joined a sketching trip organised by Ashton, and there she met Grace CROWLEY, fellow art student and artist, and they became lifelong friends and for a time developed a romantic relationship that would shape both of their lives. Like many artists of her generation, Dangar, with CROWLEY, travelled to Europe to further her artistic education, and the pair arrived in Paris in 1926, where they joined the Academy of André Lotte, a central figure in Cubism during this time. Lotte was transformative for both artists, both affirming their interest and dedication to modernism, but also presenting them with an entirely new way of thinking about the picture plane and designing the composition. Dangar returned to Sydney and by 1929 had returned to the routines of her original life, teaching alongside Ashton. But she soon learned that there was no place for modern art or Cubism at the Sydney Art School and felt stymied by what she felt was a really conservative and commercial art scene in Sydney. She found a sustaining force in the work of Albert Gleizes, another French artist whose work she had discovered in her final months in Paris at the Salon de Tuileries. Gleizes was a major exponent of Cubism, and she saw his paintings and found them entirely revolutionary and saw them as exactly what she was searching for in France. She wrote to CROWLEY and asked her to find any information she could on the artist and his work. Wanting to help her friend, CROWLEY contacted Gleizes directly and asked for private lessons that she could share with Dangar. Gleizes responded by telegramming Dangar and inviting her to join his artist community, Moly-Sabata, in the town of Sablon in the south of France. For Dangar, Gleizes' invitation came like an answer to her prayers. She was completely miserable in Sydney. She had caught a glimpse of what modern art was and she wanted to be part of that, and she felt as though the Sydney art world would never accept what she was trying to do. Moly-Sabata had been established by Gleizes as a space for artists to work free of the commercial pressures of the city, but they were forced to live a very self-sufficient lifestyle, growing their own food and generating income communally through craft and artwork. Dangar already had an interest in pottery when she arrived, and this very swiftly became her central form of income at Moly-Sabata. Dangar began working at the local potteries. She embraced the traditional methods used by local potters, in particular terre vernissée, which means cooked earth, a very rustic form of pottery using local clays, all fired in a wood kiln at a low temperature to produce functional ware used by the peasant community. Initially, Dangar began decorating her pieces with regional and traditional designs, but eventually she started to incorporate Art Deco motifs, Celtic motifs, and eventually Cubist designs derived from Gleizes' philosophies. In this way, she began to transform from a painter on canvas to a painter on clay. Dangar soon discovered that the circular forms of pottery, bowls, tureens, plates, echoed the ideas of rotation that Gleizes spoke about. At the same time, she discovered that the process of creating pottery on the wheel itself also mirrored these ideas, and that the meditative rhythms of working on a potter's wheel could lead to the same sense of spiritual exaltation that Gleizes aspired to in his work. In a letter to Gleizes in 1941, Dangar wrote, The very act of making pots taught me to understand your lessons. A little honey pot with its 2 handles and a lid can possess all the fundamental necessities of a huge Cubist composition. And when I realised this, I lost fear and I just lived in the love of this work you had taught me. Dangar began exhibiting and selling her work locally, then regionally, and by the end of the decade was exhibiting her work in Paris. In 1937, her works were featured across several venues in the Exposition Internationale in Paris, alongside some of the most eminent painters of the modern movement. The following year, in 1938, her work was included in the important exhibition Aspect Actuel de Cubisme, held at the Salon d'Automne, the progressive alternative to the Parisian salons. This was a major survey of Cubism in France of the previous decades, and her work was seen alongside artists such as Glaze and Robert Delaunay as their peer, a major achievement for an Australian artist. Following this success, Dangar was invited to travel to Morocco and work with traditional potters in Fez and help them professionalise their practice. She was enamoured with the work she saw there and later incorporated Moroccan designs and form into her own work. Unfortunately, her trip was cut short with the outbreak of the Second World War. Despite pleas from her friends and family to return to Australia, Dangar ultimately returned to Moly-Sabata and she remained in France for the duration of the war. By the late 1940s, Dangar was experiencing several health problems. She was weakened after the war and years of malnourishment due to her poverty-stricken lifestyle at Moly-Sabata. In the early 1950s, she developed a heart condition and found it increasingly hard to work at the Pottery. Despite her deteriorating health, Dangar remained passionate about her work and continued to work in the Pottery with the help of the other potters and some of her friends, creating some of her most ambitious works before her death. Only months before her death, Dangar wrote to CROWLEY in Sydney. "This afternoon, the potters are to bring me the pots they took to Roussillon to fire. I'll send you photos of them, for one plate is for the Musée de Saint-Étienne and a jug and plate for the Musée de Céramique at Firenze, Italy, the biggest museum of ceramics in the world. I wonder when Sydney will deign to give you and me orders. Perhaps in 100 years they'll pay fabulous prices for us, darling, and we'll smile down on them from above." And Dangar died on the 4th of September 1951 at the age of 65. She was interred in the hilltop cemetery of Serrières, overlooking Moly-Sabata, her home for the previous 2 decades. By the end of Dangar's life, CROWLEY and Dangar remained incredibly close. They'd been lovers throughout the 1910s and 20s, and even though they never saw each other again after 1930, when Dangar moved to Moly-Sabata, their lives remained intertwined through incredibly regular correspondence that they shared almost daily. This clip shows CROWLEY seeing Dangar's work on display in an Australian institution for the very first time, after trying for years to have her work acquired ever since Dangar's death in 1951. And it's really a reflection of how much love they did have for each other, regardless of the circumstance and the distance.
This is a plate of Anne Dangar's. I went abroad with her in 1926. She was my best friend. She was a tremendous personality.
Almost 100 years after Dangar answered the call of modern art and moved to Moly-Sabata, and 50 years after her work was first placed on display at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, The National Gallery of Australia is proud to celebrate Dangar, pioneering Cubist and one of Australia's most important modern artists.